Welcome back to Life in Stages, and I hope that we're dealing with people who are both new to and familiar with this podcast, which is a series of conversations with senior level actors, directors, writers, whose careers have been dedicated to the performing arts, a pretty precarious profession. And the curiosity I have is how people found their way into this world, how they've continued, if they have. And today we are really blessed to be with Janelle Hutchison. Janelle and I met many years ago. In our early careers, I was still acting or pretending to act at the time, and yes. And one of the great joys I have of this particular interview is that Janelle and I started together as understudies in a snappy revue called "What's a Nice Country Like You Doing in a State Like This," which was produced in a province called Ontario at Theatre in the Dell, which is now, I believe, a Hasty Market.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
And indeed, with things coming full circle, that show, that title, whatever, has relevance today again.
It does. And that was a kind of Watergate review.
Yes.
But yes, it was snappy, and I had the thrill of understudying Martin Short and Claude Tessier and Rick Whalen. And Janelle, you understudied?
Trudy Desmond, yes. Jazz singer extraordinaire, and Andrea Martin.
Right. And I raise this and fill in the details because it's too good to not use. As understudies, my task was to, of course, learn the three roles, knowing in advance that both of us would be performing, because at that point there was this thing called industrial shows, and I know that both Claude Tessier and Marty Short were already engaged across the country selling Chryslers or whatever the product was. And I know that Andrea was also booked to do that kind of thing. So I don't know how unusual, it felt unusual at the time that we were being hired as understudies knowing we would be performing. So that was quite an inducement. And in addition to that, for me, my task was to twice a week run the lights so that the stage manager, who typically ran the lights, could actually watch the show. Because at the Dell, in the 80 or so seats that were available, the running of the show was tucked behind a wall. And so that was my task, to run these lights twice a week. And Janelle, what was your task?
Oh, well, my task was to do the laundry.
Right.
So I had to collect everyone's socks and unmentionables and things, and I had to, and there were choir gowns. I had to iron them. I had to, and we got our $100 a week on our equity contract. And,
that's right.
Yeah.
And that was where Janelle
and for me
and I
as
met.
Well. Oh, yeah. Yes, indeed.
Go ahead.
And as Joel said, Andrea had this other job, which was the impetus to hire an understudy.
Right.
And then partway during my rehearsal for said performances, Trudy came to rehearsal and wrote on a piece of paper, "I have nodes, I can't sing." So suddenly I was thrown into learning the other women's part.
Okay.
And I would go back and forth. They would spray paint my little character shoes blue, and I would sing high, or red, and I would sing lower, and it was schizophrenic and lovely.
Yeah. And that was Theatre in the Dell. That was another time. And
Yes.
And then subsequently, Janelle and I had the great thrill of working on far too many cabaret dinner theater original musicals. And so we spent quite a bit of time together.
Yes, in darkened rooms. And, yes,
Right.
And those were the days where there were 6 or 8 little watts around the city where people could come and get a drink and a snack and see a show, and some of them were quite quite Tony, and others of them were not so much. And then as well with Niagara on the Lake having a venue above one of their restaurants
Right.
for people, actors who wanted to work. I mean, it was remarkable because we could go to Niagara on the Lake and do a show for 8 or 9 months during the Shaw season, and then bring it back to Toronto for another 6 months. So it represented a really long contract.
Yeah.
In contrast to, quite often today, one goes to a regional and has 6 weeks work, and then you're looking for your next gig.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it was a whole other time and other world. And I think I'm correct in saying that sort of all ended with the arrival of Cats. Once big shows came to Toronto, it certainly gave a lot of people work, but that was effectively the end of that particular era. There wasn't. I can understand it, although selfishly it was quite an abrupt shift. But how reasonable financially is it to have a show? Well, Nice Country is a really good example. 5 performers, 2 understudies, a musician, a stage manager in a room that seats 80 people.
And I think the cover charge was something like $2.50.
Yeah, and so was the quality of some of it, I'd have to say. But enough of that. We've grown.
We've grown so much. We've come so far.
That's right. But your career has been so diverse. And we lived our lives and then reconnected not that long ago. So maybe you can take us on a walking tour of your time between Nice Country and today. I mean, just
and today. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
And go. So yes, I did a number of those wonderful, wild, and wacky, but as you say, original, Canadian revues, which were pretty. It was pretty marvelous for its time.
Yeah.
And then I continued to do plays and a bit of film and TV, lots of television commercials at the time, and in the fallower times. Nice to get those residuals, coming in the mail in those days. I did a production of Company where I played Amy the Bride, the reluctant bride, that began at the NAC, and then we brought it down to Can Stage, and that was great. And not long thereafter, I was cast in the original Canadian production of Les Miserables.
Yeah.
And that was an astonishing thing for me. So I had a young son who was less than 2 years old. And so we suddenly had to say, oops, I guess we need, someone to, like the Irish nanny, of the time.
Yeah.
It was a remarkable thing being part of that company. And,
Sure.
and that was a good 4 years of my life. We played 1.5 years at the Alex. And then we went on a first Canadian national tour, which was great. We went to Calgary for about 6 weeks, and we went to Vancouver for 3.5 months, which was really quite charmed at the Queen Elizabeth Theatre.
Yeah.
And then we actually went up to Anchorage, Alaska for a couple of weeks, which was a remarkable place to visit. And then we had a few months off, and we came back and did another 1.5 years at the Alex, and finished up at the NAC.
Wow.
In Ottawa. And then shortly thereafter, said son was beginning to be approaching school age.
Yeah.
And I thought, now what? I was married at the time to someone who's also in the arts, a director, and one of us needed to be, home.
Yeah.
It wasn't about saying, there's the fridge, there's your lunchbox, Dad and I will be traveling and have a nice life.
Yeah.
So I began to rethink what it was I was doing, with my career at that point.
Yeah.
And I jokingly, would say to people, well, you're funny, you're 40, you sing, who cares? And as we know, if you're working in theater whether it's musical theater or not, the numbers of roles that are there in the canons dwindle as the years go by.
Yeah.
So I approached the then producer at the Stratford Festival to see if I could do an artist in transition grant with her, funded through the Ontario Arts Council.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, sure. So I did that and worked in production for a couple of weeks, in publicity and marketing for a couple of weeks, and then in her office, in the producer's office. And when the grant was finished, she asked if I would stay on. Mm-hmm. So I continued to work there and had a job for a year.
Yeah.
And then we moved back to Toronto, and I began kind of an arts administration career, mm-hmm. which was interesting. I worked at the what was then the O'Keefe Center, and then I worked as a casting director for nearly a dozen years, mm-hmm. As an associate with Stephanie Gorin.
Yeah.
And then I was chatting with a friend one snowy day in February, and I was in Toronto and she was in New York, and she was the chair of the Department of Drama at the Tisch School of the Arts at NYU. And I said, I'm a little tired after 37 years of being a freelancer, of not knowing whether or not you're in the middle of a good year or bad year. Or, and she said, if you really want to shake up your life, you can throw your hat into the ring for a couple of jobs here. Mm-hmm. And that's what I did, and spent 10 years running and acting a musical theater studio and dealing with 12 student productions a year, and the grades and the faculty and all of that in the Department of Drama at NYU. And then came home just 6 months or 4 months before the pandemic hit.
Wow. Okay.
So the timing turned out to be really lucky for me and providential, that I wasn't trying to run a studio with students all over the world doing ballet in their parents' living rooms, and me sequestered in a little East Village 1-bedroom apartment. So it's been grand.
Well, that's map worthy. You've got no, it is. It's fascinating how you were able to negotiate in a non-fiscal way your way through creating this path. And was there any strategy, or was it just sort of one thing at a time?
I don't know that there was ever a strategy. I think there was a kind of recalibrating and seeing what was out there and what might be interesting.
Yeah.
And, the NYU job, it was interesting because it felt like the culmination of kind of all of the things that I had done in the past were coming together, making me the right person for the job at that time.
Right.
So, kind of without any real clear strategy, things came my way, and I was ready for those opportunities. There was a moment about 10 to 15 years earlier where I thought that my path was more moving back to a freelance career as a writer. And I was really looking forward to that. And I had gone to what is now TMU, formerly Ryerson, to their School of Image Arts and taken their screenwriting classes.
Right.
And then I had gotten into the Canadian Film Centre for their 6 months film residency program, which was sort of like Camp Norman Jewison.
Yeah.
And there were 4 editors and 8 directors, 8 producers, and 8 writers, one of whom was me. And I have to say, when I went for the interview, I thought the jig was going to be up when they saw how old I was, amidst all of these young filmmakers.
Yeah.
But to their credit, that was not the case. And so I really, at one point, I really was quite convinced that I was going to be moving along to being a writer, and really looking forward to that. And it's something, funnily enough, which I've done as much as possible sporadically for the last several years, betwixt and between, jobs.
Yeah.
And then since I've been home now, it's afforded me an opportunity to get back into it in a meaningful way.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm curious, because you've lived and worked both in Canada and in the States, and in New York in particular. Is there a way of comparing or defining how each location, the personality of each location is different? Are they different? Are the people you work with different?
Yes, yes and yes. I mean, the big thing, I suppose, is just the sheer number of people and the pace of New York City. And I know people talk about that all the time.
Right.
But, can be exhausting, because your energy, you're sharing that energy out on the street and every transaction. And I've never found New Yorkers, sometimes there's a reputation out there that they're rude, or they're not rude, they're direct.
Yeah.
And they've got moxie, and they've got and they're testing you, funnily enough, to see if you've got some moxie or if you've got a sense of humor. And I actually like that. You know where you stand. But it is exhausting, and just trying to get from A to B.
Yeah.
The city kind of operates on that knife edge. And if anything happens to move that, then it can all fall apart.
Yeah.
It can be a little rain, an inch of snow. It doesn't have to be, when the president, comes to New York for the day. I mean, that really throws a monkey wrench into things. But the pace, and for me, the people, in addition to just the people you meet everywhere.
Yeah.
I was in an academic environment, and that was new to me. And there is a way that, there's a way one behaves, if you will, which is very different from being in the theater, and sort of our vernacular in that environment.
Can you talk about that a bit? How it's different?
People choose their words really carefully. There's a really interesting kind of respect isn't really the word I want, but people are careful with language. At least at the academic, institution that I was working at. And that was sort of nice and refreshing, although sometimes you just want to say enough already, and get to the point. Or it was hard because not to put too fine a point on it, but we swear in the theater, and I had to kind of clean up my mouth before somebody washed it out with soap.
And as far as the way in which theater is conducted or people behave, were you able to get any sense of how that's different in New York than it is in Toronto?
Well, there's just the volume of it.
Yeah,
is so very different. I mean, and I guess there are a lot more opportunities to work for free, in the sense of the networking and the sort of strategic plotting of trying to get a show on the board somewhere and then moved somewhere else. There's a development process there, which we don't seem to have as much of a pipeline for.
Yeah.
Although recently there have been some real strategic efforts by some Canadian theaters to really work on developing new plays and new musicals. But there, there could be 3 or 4 readings with backers, with industry people, and it might lead to the tiniest, little workshop somewhere, and then eventually, to an off-Broadway house for a short run or their fringe, that kind of thing. I went to a couple of sort of invited performances in big rehearsal halls, where shockingly, everyone who is doing it has several Broadway credits, and it is quite staged. There are no books in hand. And there is a 6 or 7 piece band on the side.
Right.
So, really amazing to see what is just a workshop or a reading, to put it on its feet, produced at that kind of level. So that whole thing, and obviously, if the investment on Broadway is, $20 million or whatever it is, you don't want to blow your one shot. So you have to take pains to be really careful along the way.
Sure.
And that was a change.
I know when my older daughter was at theater school in New York, she called, this is probably around Christmas, she said that one of her teachers had a small company and they had an annual Christmas show they did off Broadway for a limited run. And she and a couple of students were asked to be in it. And she called because she said a couple of the actors who were in it had just finished various Broadway shows. Runs, and she was astounded. I mean, she didn't yet know, but she was astounded that people with those credits would do something as modest as the show that she was going to be in. And it was probably among the very best lessons she learned.
That would be really eye-opening.
Yeah.
For sure.
And I remember seeing, there was a documentary of Carol Burnett did a return to Broadway, I guess in the mid-90s, called Moon Over Buffalo. And there's a wonderful, wonderful documentary about the creation of the show and through its run. And then there's a commentary track, and one of the actors his role was playing sort of opposite Carol Burnett, and it was so interesting to hear this because there's no other way of getting that information. But he said when he was first offered the show, his character was the principal character. He said then when Carol Burnett was hired, he said the play shifted. He still had a leading role, but he said clearly the focus had shifted to her.
Yes. Yeah.
And he didn't have, I mean, he loved her. He and the director did not become close friends, and he was very candid about how he felt about that relationship. But he did say when he was asked in this commentary, if you were so unhappy, what did you say? He said, well, it's not often in any actor's career you get you get the offer to perform on Broadway. He said, I've had 2 or 3 of those opportunities. He said, after my first one, I never imagined there would be a second one. And this was a real heavyweight guy. And that, hearing that, I still remember when I saw this being so taken by that honesty and by the reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And, in New York, if you are, whatever your type is, whatever it is you do, there are probably, 100 of you that a producer and a director and a team can choose from. And here, not so much. There might be 5 of you. So yes, and I love that about New York actors, and not just New York actors, but about most actors everywhere, that they want to work, they want to act. Actually, it was great that this just reminds me that during the pandemic, I had been working with 2 collaborators on a half-hour comedy pilot script, and with the 2 lead characters are 2 older women, something that, I clearly knew a little bit about. And we were creating a Bible, and we had a script. And because it was the pandemic, we could get anyone in the country, and did, to do a couple of Zoom readings to hear the script and talk about it and make our next changes, and then schedule another table reading on Zoom. And it was fantastic. And it was to everyone's credit that people want to work. They want to, they want to continue to explore what the next gift, if you will, is, or what, or to hone their craft. And I love that about the whole acting community. And when at orientation for our NYU students, the director of the studio would look around the room and say, I want you to look around, because these are all your future collaborators.
Yeah.
And you will be creating work together, and not waiting for the phone to ring, with your agent telling you there's a job. But in between those times, you will be creating your own work with everybody that is, in this room with you.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to go back, and this now goes back quite a bit. I mean, you mentioned earlier that you started with Les Miserables when your son was a wee boy, right?
Yes. Yeah, he had just turned 2.
Yeah.
And when I was doing company,
right,
he was 3 months old only, and I was still breastfeeding him. And at rehearsals, at my lunchtime, the two people who were looking after him would bring him to the NAC.
Yeah.
And I would eat my sandwich, and he would have his lunch, and then they would take him away again.
Yeah.
So he was, quite familiar with the backstage antics.
Yeah.
And he was just 2 when we started Les Mis.
So over a period of years, before you wondered, what parenting meant when your son was in school and you were beginning to sort of reevaluate, what is touring and parenting like for you and during that time?
It was, I think, probably as good and as easy as it could be, because of the scale of the show.
Right.
So I wasn't on the bus and truck tour of Moon Over Buffalo.
Yeah.
It was, because it was Les Mis, we were sitting down, if you will, for longer periods of time. And there was a great young woman who had been the chaperone for the kids backstage at Les Mis, because, there were the 2, Cosette and Gavroche, 2 larger roles, and then a smaller role of young Eponine. And there were 3 young girls and 2 boys who alternated, and made sure, obviously, that was like an insurance policy if a child was ill.
Yeah.
And there was a chaperone backstage who looked after them.
Right.
She, for an kind of an unfair reason, had not been asked to join the tour. And so I asked her to come on tour with me.
Okay.
And Matt knew her, my son knew her,
right,
because he'd been backstage a number of times.
Yeah.
So off we went with me and the nanny, and then my husband would join us in between his directing gigs in whatever city we were.
Right.
And in Vancouver, it was actually really lucky that the company manager, the formidable Eric Goldstein, found me an apartment, a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom apartment on the top floor of a house in a great area. And there was a family who owned the house with 4 kids, underneath us, and they had a pool. And so it was like being at, camp for the summer. And
right.
So every morning I'd get up and get my coffee and put on my bathing suit, and we would just go and hang out at the pool.
Yeah.
And because, Matt was an inner city kid from Toronto
Yeah.
with, postage size gardens or lawns or outdoor space, if you have any. He phoned his grandmother when we first arrived and said that there was a park next door to the house, which was, of course, their front yard. The touring was about as easy as it could be for me in that situation, and I recognize that a very different experience than some of the other kinds of touring that you couldn't possibly really bring a young child on and would have to have your another parent at home or a grandparent or someone who was looking after the wee one.
I've worked out of town. I did that for a while. I didn't do that a lot, but I did it for a while, and that was always, Phyllis was at home, so that allowed me to be away. But being away from home for, I don't know, anywhere from 4 to 6 to 8 weeks at a time was so disorienting, and I admired the people for whom that was something that they looked forward to. And met a couple of particularly actors who were very used to doing that, and that was also at a time when I think there was probably more traveling back and forth across the country. It didn't feel as regionally focused as perhaps it is now, but I don't know that I have the best vantage since I haven't done that for a long time.
Well, and in those days that you're talking about, you're also. It's pre-Zoom, it's pre-FaceTime, pre-cell phone, being able to call, in terms of long distance. If you could hear somebody's voice once a week, I mean, that was a lot. And if you think of sort of the challenges of that emotionally and psychologically, both for, the person on the road and for the kids and the family back home, that's pretty significant.
It was. And, returning exhausted and then switching gears, to be helpful to the person who had been taking care of everything.
Yes.
It's a toll, and
because the person who's been taking care of everything just wants to be able to say, "Okay, over to you."
Absolutely.
And and I mean, I remember sort of days that it's easier. At least it was for me when my son was younger. And then you reach those marvelous teenage years. And I remember, there were moments where my son's father would come home from being away for 4 or 5 weeks, and my son would sort of, dig in his heels about the fact that now he had 2 people telling him what to do instead of just one. Mom and I were getting along just fine, and now you want to get back in the game. I don't think so.
And has there been any point in Matt's life where he was performing or attracted to any aspect of the performing world?
Oh yes, yes. I mean, we went through the moment when he was about 12, where he came to me with a friend and said, "Mom, we've decided we'd like to be actors." And so I said, "Oh, great. Well, your father and I both work, so we're not taking you to auditions, particularly not commercial auditions." And because I had worked in casting, I had seen that was really a full-time job for parents, and any parent who is going to allow and encourage their kids to do something like commercials, at least in those days. You have to be prepared to go somewhere with them and take them to a studio, 3 times a week, before the days of self-tapes. But in any case, I said to him, okay, you can go and chat with Auntie Rhonda, who was an agent, and she had a meeting with them and said, "You have to be serious and learn your lines and this and that. If I'm going to represent you, it's my reputation too." And I said to him, it's probably going to take a good 2 years before you book anything. So don't be discouraged. And he went right out and got himself a television series. So he did 26 episodes of Little Men, which was co-produced by CTV and the PAX network of the time.
Okay.
And so he was like living in the 1800s, which was fantastic in terms of everything he learned beyond being on a set and working in that environment. And as an only child, he suddenly had this incredible community of other young people. It was a family. So that was fantastic. And he did that for a couple of years. And then he got braces, which does put a little, dent in your ability to be an actor on film and television in any case.
Yep.
And but he did audition for and go to the Etobicoke School of the Arts, as in their drama program, and that was great for him. Yeah. He ultimately didn't do anything with it as an adult, beyond which have an affinity for theater and for film, and he's got a great critical eye. I've often thought he would make a great director, but he's got other fish to fry. And,
right. Yeah, that is watching your children grow, regardless of where they move.
Because Jessica, your daughter, is a lovely actress, and so you had all of that as she was growing up as well.
Yeah, and I think we all, those of us who do this work, when a child says, "This is what I want to do," after you pause and try not to be negative. But I remember she was at McGill, and she didn't do any theater courses, but McGill has an incredibly active student life, and she was very involved with theater, and particularly with a lot of people in music. And I was working in Montreal a fair amount at that time, and she announced, she said, "This is really what I want to do. How do I do it?" I said, "Well, in Canada, you've got, you're going to need to train. And in Canada, there aren't that many options."
No.
There are some good options, but
I hope you like Montreal, because you can go to the National Theatre School.
Right. And so she said, "Well, I want to do it right now." I said, "Well, you've got one more year of school, and you're going to finish that, and you're also not ready because you haven't done any research at all about where you want to go, what you want to do. You need to..."
Really good advice, really.
Yeah, I thought so. And and then she did it. I mean, at the time there was a manual, a manual of American theater schools.
Right.
And I said, "Okay, so the Canadian options, you can count on one hand. And here's this tome." I said, "Now, you can probably eliminate, 47 of the states, but just realize what you are thinking of, that you've got literally hundreds and hundreds of schools that advertise that this is what they do." So she did that. And the exercise of going through it, but most of all, just the experience of having been in New York for a few years, was quite amazing. And for us as well, as parents watching it.
Yes.
And the stamina that it takes, and
that kind of determination. The determination, the stamina, the single-mindedness.
Yeah.
When I was at NYU, and initially, it was a new studio, and the first studio that they'd created in undergrad drama in, 40 years or something, some large number in any case. And we had 100 freshmen every fall. And then later on, it was more like 66 or something like that. But these were all of them, equally single-minded, talented, thoroughbreds who were used to being the leads in whatever, shows and productions that their schools would have or their communities would have.
Yeah.
And they were suddenly in an environment where, everybody around was just as committed and just as accomplished as they.
Yeah.
And that was a bit of a change in thinking for them, that they weren't sort of like the top of the heap anymore.
Yeah.
So you really do have to have that kind of stamina and that kind of foundation. And
yeah. Oh no. The learning how to never take no for an answer and be able to commit to that.
Yes.
Having met a lot of students who wanted to do this, the self-selection process or the self-selection to the exit is a pretty busy corridor. Because it doesn't take for many people, it doesn't take a lot of rejection to realize if this is the rhythm and the pattern that I'm looking forward to, I don't know that I can do this or that I want to do this.
No, indeed. And some people realize that quickly.
Yeah.
And for some people, they might have sort of the promise of a career, a carrot dangling and may work and then realize, 10 years later or however many years later that they need to make a shift. Some of my alums have been, on Broadway and have done significant film and television work. And some of them have, gone back to grad school, and some of them are teaching, and some of them are, becoming massage therapists. So there really is a shift. But you're right that the notion of not taking no for an answer, and if you are the administrator in a program with, lots of those kids with 230, then it can be exhausting, and good for them that they have learned to advocate for themselves, and so that they do stick to it and stick with it.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, it became one of our family's expressions that maybe is my favorite form of yes, because when my son was 5, a babysitter, he asked if he could do something. She said no. And then later on, he kept at her. She said maybe. And then he jumped for glee as if she had said yes, because he then said to her, because maybe is my favorite form of yes, because he knew if he could get you to maybe, he could get a yes. He could wear you down.
Yeah.
And so.
Yeah. No, and yes. And we've both seen in the professional world how that works too.
Yes, indeed. No, because you never know. You never know which brings you back to the idea of, I may have done a Broadway show or two, but now I'm going to do this workshop of this musical or this reading for free.
That's right.
Because you never know where one thing is going to lead.
Right.
And so, not saying no and always being open and saying yes is something you really, it's useful in every avenue, I suppose, but it's particularly useful in the arts.
Yeah. Now, going back again a little bit to what you were talking about when you mentioned, the work you did at the Tisch School, and that you were either producing, coordinating, overseeing 12 productions. How do you do 12 productions a year? I mean, what does that take, and how do you do that year after year after year?
Well, it's I suppose I was putting in 70-hour weeks, no question. And there would be, the sophomores had their shows in the spring. That was the first opportunity for them to perform. And then the juniors and seniors each had productions in the fall and the spring. in the Department of Drama at the Tisch School of the Arts, there is a studio which is production and design.
Okay.
So that meant that there were young student designers, lighting designers, sound designers, costume designers that we could have access to. Is not really the expression I want, but there was a symbiosis with that. And they needed to begin to work on projects and to begin to work with professional directors and figure out what that and work with tight budgets and in various spaces. So that was really helpful. I would have to hire some designers, and depending on the scale of the project, but always hiring directors. There would be students who were great dancers, that was sort of their primary background of their triple threat thing, and they might be the assistant choreographer and get that experience as well. And it was big, it was exhausting, and it was obviously doing it with very limited resources. And for me, learning how to say to people, this is all the money that we have. This is in no way, saying anything about how I value your work, but it's a student production. We charge nothing for tickets. Right. So I had to navigate that at the same time as the classes, the schedules, the grades, the faculty, all of that, and which a lot of that was budgeting, which was very new to me. And I thought, my high school math teacher must be rolling over in his grave to hear, wait, you entrusted her with what? How many millions of dollars in an academic year? And it was great, but it was tense making. It was exhausting, but to find out that you could actually do it, when you hadn't quite known that you could previously, when you're doing your little box step and singing your harmonies, it was quite a journey. Yeah.
And I find, that actors probably maybe more than any of the other areas in our work are particularly actors who've been at the work for a while, are possessed of so many skills and have, much more than they give themselves credit for. When you're on the board of Studio 180 Theatre, and I was previously the artistic director. When we started, we started that not with a plan to be an ongoing company, but as that happened and evolved, it was mostly a small group of actors who were creating work for themselves, as I was creating work for myself. And then we talked about the various activities that were essential for the ongoing health of the company. And none of those were about acting or directing. It was managing and creating an education program and doing all outreach, all of those things, and sort of handing it to three people in particular and saying, so this is what we need. Go do it. I've got other things. This is not what I do. Yeah. And they said, this isn't what we do. I said, but it has to be what you're going to have to figure this out. It's not that, it actually isn't that hard if you give yourself credit for having the imagination to do this. And they did. And they've said themselves, even the actors they've brought, particularly to the education program, artist educators who are largely actors who work with high school students and are always surprised, especially when they're doing it the first or second time, they seem always surprised to learn how much capacity they have for working with, and not teaching by saying, do this, do that, but skills they didn't realize they had. And that was probably one of the most enriching aspects of teaching that I found in the work that I've done.
Yeah, I think that, actors are amazing at all of those things. And they have a capacity for learning, and they have, interests. And there is that notion that you don't just wait for the phone to ring. You have to create your own work. And so that is satisfying and also empowering in a way, because so much of acting, and particularly years ago, used to feel like it was one of those hat in hand kind of scenarios, that you were asking for someone to hire you, to take a chance on you, to give you a job, to not, so you weren't in a way one of the adults in the room, and now that has shifted in such a positive way.
Yeah.
And actors have so much to offer, and this notion where actors are also, writers and directors and producers, and
Yeah.
and
When when you were a lot younger and your career was shaping, you made reference before to sort of fallow periods and good years, bad years. How do you learn, or how did you learn, and were you able to, by your own experience, help the younger performers, the younger people trying to establish careers, how you deal with the uncertainty and the inevitability that a job ends without the next job already committed or even in sight?
Yeah, I mean, that is a real, I suppose that is the idea of teaching young artists about what do you do, in between the jobs. And when I was at NYU, there actually was a class in the spring term of the senior year, which was called Acting as a Business.
Mm-hmm.
And they would begin to learn about, making a business plan and all of those things that they needed to know, which would help them through, the fallow periods. I was lucky in the sense that I had a partner, so a partner who had a job, so that I didn't have to worry about, oh my God, how am I going to pay my rent next month? Because my paycheck for doing this show is going to be, I'm not going to have it anymore.
Yeah.
So yes, it is about figuring out what else you do, what else, speaks to you, what else you're passionate about, what else, once you scratch the surface, you begin to find out that that people have come up with, interesting, innovative things and creative things that they do. I know of an actress, dancer, choreographer, and very successful. She has a jewelry making business, that's very successful on the side. So she gets an opportunity in between productions to focus her energies on that. Years ago, there was a group of very successful house contractors and renovators.
Yeah.
And they were all actors. And they had this remarkable skill set. And, and in the community, they had lots of people who were vying for their time.
Yeah. So okay. So as we move ever closer to the finish line,
Act 3.
Yeah. Okay. Act 3 yet to be titled.
Yes.
Through everything you've described about how your life has moved, how have you carved, where has the personal life had a chance to develop or grow or strive when so much of your time is spent, or certainly has been spent, dedicated to the work itself?
Yeah, and that's an interesting concept, the idea that, I've thought about that recently often, and sort of long and hard in terms of what defines me. And if you're sort of pulling the rug out from what defines you, i.e., are you retired? Are you no longer working? Then that's challenging psychologically, because you feel like oh, what good am I now? You know, what am I doing? How am I going to spend the next, you know, hopefully 20 healthy years? And so you have to redefine yourself, you know, in order to stay contented. I fortunately have always loved writing. And so I've written a novel, which began as a book of short stories. And I have a wonderful agent that I was lucky enough to have a mutual friend connect me with, Michael Levine, who is working on finding a publisher for this novel. And in the meantime, I've started work on a next novel. And there are lots of times that I don't get, you know, much of a chance to sit down and write. There's sort of an ebb and flow to that. But at least that is satisfying in terms of feeling like I haven't been put out to pasture, and I'm sort of in charge of, you know, still of that myself. You know, I obviously have a stake in, you know, my son and his happiness and his, you know, as now a 37-year-old man. I'm traveling and, you know, and all of that, but it is trying to figure out how to stay connected and satisfied and creative. For the first time in 16 years, I just got back on stage and did a play last month at the Toronto Fringe Festival, a new Canadian play, a four-hander called Dead Right, written by Kate Barris and David Shatsky, and which Brian Azamock directed. And we were down at the Alumni Theater, and that was, you know, a remarkable thing to say yes to. I was thrilled to have been asked. And there's always interesting exploration when you're working on a new piece for a first production. But just the notion personally of saying, I'm going to say yes to this. I'm going to put myself back in that position and see kind of, you know, whether or not I still love it, whether or not I've still got the goods. And I thought it would be a quiet little under the radar, you know, outing. And I was shocked at how many people came out to see it and how many people from, you know, all of the various and sundry parts of my life through the years came to see me. It was great. So there are unexpected surprises that one can look forward to, you know, in the Act 3 kind of scenario.
Oh, that is a really great way to end this conversation, and I hope that it doesn't end our conversations. Thank you, Janelle. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Joel, for asking me to do this. It was a pleasure.
Oh, good. And for all of you who are listening, please consider subscribing to Life in Stages, this podcast, which features a galaxy of wonderful professionals whose insights are really healthy and helpful and honest. For those of you who would like to help support the podcast to continue, you can go to patreon.com, patreon.com/lifeinstages. Donations are gratefully accepted, and the instructions on the Patreon website are very clear. That will help to sustain the podcast. This is a non-monetized, non-marketing, self-funded enterprise, and please tell everybody you meet every day of the week. Thanks.
Bravo to you, Joel.
Bless you, Janelle. Thanks again, and thank you all very much. Bye-bye.